Hi, I'm Sarah. Welcome to session 2 of our series on sexuality, God and teenagers. My job today is to help you consider who is influencing your teenagers. So we're going to be thinking about the voices they're listening to. Teenagers are exposed to so many voices outside of the home. So if we're silent on important conversations, how are they going to know God's best? Proverbs 22 verse 6 reminds us to train up a child in the way he should go. There is no excuse for silence in the home or in the church. We have a mantle from God to teach our children. We all know how important it is to engage with teenagers, but are we asking the right questions? Do we get to the root of some of the more important issues to understand where they get their information from? For example, what do they know about drugs? Where did they get that information from? What do they know about porn? Where did they get that information from? And what do they know about God? And where did they get that information from? Obviously, we are much more in control of what they know about God because as Christians, we're talking about Him, teaching them His word and modelling how He asks us to live. But what about the big issues of the day? Drugs, abortion, sexuality, porn. When was the last time you had a conversation about any of those? Of course, a lot of their knowledge will be gleaned from a number of different sources, depending upon the type of teenager they are and the circles they mix in. These include the internet or social media, the school they're at and the different teachers and other students and what their experiences are, and their friends and members of the wider family, what they're watching on television or the films they watch, perhaps newspapers, news channels, or even politicians, church from your pastor or your youth leader. And that's not an exhaustive list, but it's still helpful for us to work through this and get a feel for their key influencers. Once you have a better understanding, you can explore these sources with them. How accurate do they think this information is? This gives you a chance to chat about the downfall of some sources of our information and the phenomenon of fake news, specific ideologies, and the cancel culture. If the opportunity arises from the answers they give you, you can remind them of God's view as opposed to the world's view, and challenge them to consider which viewpoint they are listening to. Turning the conversation round to God and considering which voices talk about things from a faith perspective as opposed to those that talk from a non-faith perspective is helpful. Challenge them to think that through. What differences might they hear from people speaking from each perspective? You would expect them to be aware that those with a faith will draw on their beliefs in how they talk about worldly issues. Having a faith challenges us to speak, think, and act differently from others. So here's a question you could ask them. Ask them about their view of why God invented sex and see which viewpoint they are reflecting most. If they are speaking from a worldview, discuss how they formulated their thoughts and opinions and see what the basis is for that. Then talk about God's view and see where there may be a difference. What are the barriers to them understanding God's view? For example, do they think it's unfair that single people should not have sex? Do they think the Bible is unclear about sex? Do they think that love is love, that there should be no distinction between heterosexual and homosexual love? Be patient as you discuss. Really seek to understand their worldview and how it has been formed before you start to talk about God's view and how you have come to trust in that. It's important to explain that Christians need to listen to God. Remember in session 1 when we talked about Him being our creator and providing the help screens? We may muddle through doing it our way, but having the help and following the guidelines means so much more than just muddling through or existing. It means we are able to thrive. Chat about how they hear from God and how they can seek His opinion on something as important as sexual orientation. There are a number of ways they can do this, and you may suggest to them reading the Bible for themselves, chatting with God and asking Him to show them what He is saying, and explaining how they can take time to listen to God and find out what He's saying. and they may want to look at what other Christians are saying through different books or videos and see what fits best with what the Bible teaches. There is so much information on YouTube or Google, but of course it's important that we explain discernment and how we are called to test everything we read or hear with the Bible. They can continue this conversation with you or other trusted adults about what they feel God is saying, and they can speak to their pastor or their youth leader. And it's important that we address how do they know that they are hearing from God and how they can discern when God is speaking to them. We can explain how they can tell the difference between God's truth and Satan's lies. Do we learn about people we know and love only from what other people say about them? No. We learn by spending time with them. And the more we can learn to recognize God's voice and truth, the easier it is to see when the world is trying to suck us into its way of thinking. I recognize this may all sound quite simplistic, and yes, it is, but it's something we cannot afford to neglect. So in summary, spend time with the teenagers you are working with, understanding who or what they are listening to and what they're believing. If you're a parent, perhaps audit the amount of quality time you are spending with them to ensure that you are the main influencer in helping them to understand God's worldview. Youth leaders, think about how much of your time you spend helping teenagers navigate sexuality and identity. Thanks for joining us today and investing in young people. I hope that we've given you some food for thought and tools to speak to the teenagers in your life. Join me for more videos in this series found on our website, transformedbygodslove.com. And if you have any questions or would like further advice, you can contact us via the website and we will be happy to connect.